Howdy, this is Mackenzie Franklin from SideGame LLC here in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Today we're going to be doing a What We've Been Playing episode live. So if you have any questions or comments, if you're watching this live, please feel free to put them into the comments, and then I'll make sure that I respond to them about any of the games that we're talking about here. Now, I have 4 specific games that I want to talk about today, and a lot of these games have a question attached to them. Now, the first game we'll dive right into is, let me pull up here. Sorry about that. The first game that I want to talk about is Glory to Rome. Now, Glory to Rome is an engine building game of card management. You'll have a hand of cards that you'll be using to take different actions. And with these actions, you're going to be trying to build buildings and then recur some additional actions. So that means you're going to be trying to get these different cards, and these cards in turn are going to give you extra additional actions. So what are the actions? Well, the first actions are recruit more people to give you more actions. The second action is put out those buildings from your hand and start working on them. And then you can actually put materials into those buildings and complete them, so you gain their abilities, their extra influence, which is points, or you can also use their effects immediately when they're built. Some will also give you passive bonuses, and the harder a building is to build, the more interesting thing that it's going to do when it's completed. And then the last couple things that you can do are you can demand resources from your opponents, you can collect resources from the center of the table, and then lastly, you can send some of the resources you collected into your vault, and these are going to be worth extra points at the end. Now, the thing that I want to talk about in particular about Glory to Rome is an expansion for the game. And I know this might be a really weird thing to see. Hey, why are we talking about an expansion for a game that's super, super old and super hard to get? The main reason I want to talk about this expansion is because of what it does to the entire game. This is what's called the Republic expansion. So the way the Republic expansion works is it's going to completely replace a set of cards from the game. So you're removing 4 of a single type of card, replacing it with 4 new ones, but you also are going to make a drastic rules change. Now, this rules change has you taking an entire aspect of the game and turning it on its head. Now, one core concept of this game is you have these jacks and they're wilds. You can use them to take any action on your turn, and to grab them, normally you can skip your whole turn to take one of these wild cards. Now, instead of using a jack as a wild, you can also discard 3 of a kind from your hand in order to do the same thing, copy an action. However, when you do that, the way this game works is every time you use a card to take an action, it goes into the center of the table as resources for all of the other players. Now, I really like this concept because it's up to the players based on what they're doing in order to populate the board with resources. But the Republic expansion changes those rules. Not only are you going to have a different starting hand, replace some of the cards, but you also are going to change the amount of cards required to take a wild action. It only costs 2 cards now, which means this is going to happen way more frequently. So this means that players are going to be following more often. Players are going to be populating the center of the table with more cards, which is going to make the resources flow a lot more fluidly. So I think this is a really cool approach to an expansion because it changes the core experience. And not only does it add that rule, but it's also used more as a way to introduce new players to the game because you have a bit more freedom with the actions. In addition, some of the instant win condition cards have been changed. For example, one of the cards that's replaced is the Forum Remedium. In the original game, the Forum said that you just win instantly if you have 6 of the clientele, which are those extra actions. You just win if you have 6 of the different colors. I really like this. It's kind of like the Infinity Gauntlet, right? You're trying to get all the different colors of different characters. Super funny. But it also introduces a lot of new abilities that are going to give you more flexibility with your actions. You have the Crane, which lets you always do an Architect action, which means you're always going to be building. You have the Tribunal, which allows you to get more wilds every time you draw cards. It just gives you a lot of flexibility. I think that's a great approach for a game system. Now, my question to you is, in the games that you've played, have you experienced an expansion that has such a drastic rules change like this? Now, this rules change is drastic because of the implications it has with the entire game system, populating more resources, making it more player friendly. But some expansions are just usually adding on a piece. So that inadvertently will change the game up. But I think that this one hits it to the core. I think that's a great idea. What games have you played that changed the entire dynamic by messing with one rule? I'd love to hear what you think on this. And if you've played this expansion, I'd love to hear your thoughts. That brings us to our next game, one of my favorite games. This is going to be Marvel Champions. So Marvel Champions here is wonderful. I love the deck building, the deck construction. I love being a hero, and we were lucky enough to receive a brand new big box expansion for the game in the form of Sinister Motives. Now, Sinister Motives has 2 heroes that come in the box, as well as a set of 5 scenarios. And these scenarios are all Spider-Man themed, which is amazing. You have some really small characters like Mysterio and Sandman, which are threats on their own. And then you have these really cool team up scenarios where you have the Venom Goblin that's teamed up together in one big character, or you actually have the Sinister Six themselves, and they'll be swapping out each other and summoning themselves as the game progresses. The Sinister Six scenario is probably one of my favorite scenarios I've played in a long time. I love that you're constantly having to fight off individual characters, and it's just such a satisfying experience when you finally make it through the onslaught of these superpowered characters. So I really like that one, and even Sandman is really good. I love the way that he's putting pressure on you to actually defend as opposed to just jump blocking. Great stuff in this expansion. One thing that I want to talk about in particular, though, has to do with some of the heroes that came in the box. So the heroes are Spider-Gwen, so you have Ghost Spider as well as Miles Morales, who's Spider-Man. And these 2 heroes are very interesting. Not only do they have some really cool following cards, some cool aspect cards with the shield agents that are going to be introduced, but also the web warriors. But Spider-Man in particular is one that I want to talk about because I actually have an issue with his design. Let's take a look at Spider-Man here. So Spider-Man says that he has 2/2/2, which is a great stat line, but his effect here says Venom Blast Special. Now, the special tag says that whenever you have something with special, you do not get to use that special ability right away. The special ability is only triggered off of another card. He has 2-fold specials. The first one deals 2 damage to an enemy, stun the enemy. The other one is Spider Camouflage Special, gives Spider-Man a tough status card, confuse an enemy. Now, the reason that I have an issue with this design choice is because Spider-Man himself does nothing. He does not have an active ability. When you have Spider-Man on his own, he really isn't a special hero at all. When you print text on a card like this, you are essentially writing a blank card and removing the keywords from other cards. What do I mean by this? Spider-Man's hero cards will say trigger Venom Blast or trigger Spider Camouflage. They could have just as easily on those Spider-Man cards just written deal 2 damage to an enemy, stun that enemy. But they didn't. They instead just wrote that keyword Venom Blast or Spider Camouflage. Now, I think this is really unfortunate because I really like the Spider-Man character, the Miles Morales version, but they've reduced his effects to just being a glossary for keywords. And I find that really frustrating because that means that your deck building potential around Spider-Man Miles Morales is significantly less. Now, I want to give you some examples here as to some good designs for hero cards and hero abilities. So let's look at Spider-Man and She-Hulk. This is the original Spider-Man from the core game, and this is She-Hulk from the core game. Spider-Man's ability says, whenever the villain initiates attack against you, you get to draw a card. This is a really cool effect because it works with other cards. You have this effect that's printed that you always have active, so you can build an entire deck around it. You're not waiting for those specific other hero cards to trigger this effect. For example, there are some Justice cards where you can play and they'll just make the villain attack you, which will trigger Spider-Man's ability. You may be playing a weird variant where you're just trying to egg on the villain. It's very similar to Drax's playstyle. And then you have She-Hulk here, who has the effect of whenever she changes into this form, you deal 2 damage to an enemy. I love this idea because it's going to push you to want to switch as often as possible. You are going to actively be flipping into your hero mode to deal extra damage and have these big swing turns. I love this because it's going to push you into a unique playstyle, and that effect is printed on your hero card. These cards are not just glossaries for other card effects, and I love that because you have this design space and you have this active ability that is permanent. So in game designs, I really enjoy when cards have their own unique effects as opposed to just being maybe a word bank or just being blank in general. Do you have any games like this that fall into this trap? Any characters that you've recognized that you're like, oh, this makes sense with this? I'd love to hear your thoughts on different abilities and when it's okay to have a card that does nothing and when you really want a card that does something special. And for me in Marvel Champions, that's one of the things that I enjoy the most about the game is that the heroes are all unique. They all have different ways to deck build around them as opposed to being completely blank slates. So that is Marvel Champions. Let's go ahead and move on to the next game. The next game is going to bring us to my main question of this episode, and that is Familiar Tales. Familiar Tales, I've been playing this a lot this past week here, and this is a storytelling experience where you are playing as a group of familiars. Think very similar to a Disney princess story where you have these animal sidekicks, but those are the main characters, and you're protecting a baby princess. As the game progresses, that princess will age up. Right now, I'm in the middle of Era 2, which means that the character, the baby, is now a toddler. Well, not a toddler. She's probably like 4 or 5 years old. I think she's actually 6. So she'll be able to actually walk around with you. She's got a bit of an attitude, and you get to see her create her personality as the game continues. I really enjoy this, and there's some great storytelling aspects. That's my favorite part of this game is the storytelling. It's the thing that I'm excited for. I'm listening intently to the story. The voice acting is wonderful, and right now, one of my favorite voice actors, Pros D, he is talking right now, and he's playing one of the main characters, and I'm really enjoying it. That's Sungwon, so he's doing some great stuff there. So I really enjoy the voice acting. It's a blast. I think Gribbert is probably my favorite character out of all the familiars. He's just got such a great attitude about the whole thing. But the thing that I find myself doing in this game is whenever I play Familiar Tales, I'm always excited to hear the story, and then my enjoyment tends to stop when I actually get to the gameplay. And that is super unfortunate. So the game has you, based on whatever solo capacity or multiplayer capacity, constructing a deck of cards. And this cards has a bunch of different action symbols, and then these actions are tied to stats and abilities. On your turn, you can do whatever you want with these cards. You can use them to move, you can use them to interact with the board, or you can save them for the next round. Generally, you're going to want to play your cards because at the end of your turn, you're going to draw back up. So you'll move on this map, you'll attack things, and you move around. At a certain point in each of these rounds, you're going to defeat all of the enemies that are on the board, and the game itself has absolute freedom. There are resource spots that are on the board that you'll need to go to gather resources from. You can search through your deck and use these special abilities over and over again to gain a lot of extra resources. And this has led me to having too much freedom in this game. And I think that is pretty unfortunate because it's making this game a bit more stale, because to do the optimal thing, you're going to need to almost grind, and it's not very fun in my opinion. So what do I mean by this? I mean that there is no pressure that's pushing you to actually continue and to continue the story, as opposed to just farming resources and push you forward. Now, I know this is totally something you could avoid. You can just end the chapter early and just ignore it. But the game itself, its pressure that it puts on you is in the form of a misfortune dial. You have this discontent marker that at the end of every 3 or so turns, when your danger gets high enough, you'll have to resolve this discontent button on the application, because this is an app-driven game. So you click on the application, it'll tell you if you have 4 or less discontent, then you're going to move one of your discontent markers up 1. Now, to reduce the discontent, that's an action that you can take on your turn. So you can play cards to reduce that dial by 1. And so essentially, for every 1 turn that you're taking to decrease the discontent, you have 2 turns that you can do whatever you want with. And that's the issue that I'm having here, is there's no real penalty to just ignoring this whole discontent marker, using a turn to do so, and then taking 2 actions with the rest of your cards. And it's kind of unfortunate, because this openness is really preventing me from enjoying this game, because I think that the game is actually a bit too tedious, not just in this aspect, but also with the other facets, including the combat. I don't find it that satisfying with the different actions and skill tests that you're taking. And the solo mode itself has some weird aspects as well that I'll talk about later. But the big thing that I want to focus on here is the freedom of the cards. So the freedom here is essentially the consequence for taking too long is not there. And I want to talk about some other games that I think do this really well. So the first game I want to talk about is Sleeping Gods. So Sleeping Gods is my favorite adventure game. And the way that it prevents you from meandering and taking forever to do things is with the use of an event deck. There will always be this timer in the form of your event deck. You have 16 turns. Yep, 16 turns each era. And during those eras, you're going to be building out your character, exploring, and just trying to gather as many totems as possible. Once the event deck runs out, then you're going to have some sort of experience, rebuild the event deck. But after that third event deck run through, your game is over. You better have collected enough totems. So this essentially is always ticking in the back of your head, and you're thinking to yourself, I have to do something. I cannot just dilly-dally. I can't get a coin this turn. I have to be progressing somewhere, and I have to be trying to go after that totem. You are going to have some turns where you're going to rest and recover, but this is going to push you to make those risky plays, allocate a bunch of damage onto your characters or your ship, and push you to those big battles that you'll find throughout your adventures. I really like this because it's a constant threat and it is the end of the game. The next game that does this timer well is Gloomhaven. Gloomhaven's threat that prevents you from having too much freedom are the cards themselves. In Gloomhaven, you have these action cards that you'll be using to take your moves on the board. You can move around, you can do combats, you can get passive abilities. However, if you run out of cards, you'll need to take a long rest. And when you do so, one of these cards is removed permanently. This is a beautiful system because you can take as long as you want and you can plan it out with those cards in your hand, but you know at a certain point you are going to become exhausted because you're just going to run out of cards. I love this because it prevents you from taking too much time. The other thing I enjoy about this is if you satisfy the objective, the scenario ends there. I believe you finish out that turn and then it's just done. I think everybody, you finish that round potentially, but you finish out that round and it's over. So even if you're out there slaying all the monsters, you can't just loot all the bodies afterwards. You have to, in the middle of your combat, go and do the looting. So you have that pressure of the timer of the cards, and also you have the pressure of the monsters that you need to keep on the board. And this ties into the next one I want to talk about, which is Middara. So Middara has something very similar to Gloomhaven, where the creatures are essentially the timer. In Middara, as long as there's at least one enemy on the board, you have nothing extra that you have to do. But as soon as you slaughter all of the enemies, then time tokens start appearing. If you ever have 3 time tokens, I believe, in Middara, you just instantly lose the scenario. No ifs, ands, or buts. And time tokens are generated at the end of a round if no monsters activated, essentially. And I really enjoy this. I think this is really cool because just like Gloomhaven, it's forcing you to actively be searching and participating in the middle of your fights. Now, unfortunately, in Familiar Tales, one of the issues is you can basically prioritize defeating all the characters and then participate in all of the story stuff afterwards. And so the game flow becomes very stale. Your action sequences, I'm going to get my things, I'm going to take out any villains that show up. After they're killed, I'm going to go ahead and look every single item that's on the board, collect everything, and then move on to the next page. It becomes a little less tedious. It becomes a little more tedious because there's no pressure. There's no thing that's driving you forward. And I don't find the combat that interesting because you're generally maybe doing 1 or 2 damage every single time. It's very repetitive. There's not a lot of creativity in the different characters and the different monsters. But you have to keep in mind this is I would say I'm halfway done. So I finished the first era, I'm in the second era, and I'm about halfway through that second era. So this is my impression of Familiar Tales. I believe that the game is too free and doesn't have a pressure that's going to be pushing you and driving you to making difficult, intense choices. And I think that games like Gloomhaven, Sleeping Gods, and Middara balance this really well. So what do you think? What are the games that offer you freedom, but also that tense form of pressure? And what games for you offer you too much freedom? They give you way too much choice and not enough restriction to drive you forward, whether it be in a competitive setting, a cooperative setting, like in Familiar Tales or the other games that I discussed. I'd love to hear what you think. So that's everything for Familiar Tales. Let's move on to a different style of game, and one of my favorite games I've played in a while. This is a filler game called Vabanque. Vabanque was recommended to me by Dan from Chairman of the Board, and I just want to give a big shout out to him because I think this game is wonderful. So Vabanque has you playing as these owners of casinos. You'll be moving around the table to different casino tables and collecting cash there. However, during this process, you're going to be putting out money on these casino tables, and then you'll be playing cards on these casino tables. One of those cards is a bluff, one is a raise, which doubles the amount of money that people get there, and the last one is a trap. If an opponent goes there, you take the money that they would get instead. Now, the new edition has some really cool component pieces, which I'm pretty impressed with because they're so dang simple, but they're chunky, they're nice, they're big, and they're clear. The older version, as you can see here, this is the only one I can find a photo of right now, has these, obviously, it's a little dated chips, but the gameplay is there. Now, the reason I like this game so much, and I think it works so well as a filler, is first off, it is so easy to teach. This is a game where you set up the components and you just run through a single round and you're ready to go. And the best thing is, if people are really excited to just jump in and play, you can do that because the first round is not punishing at all, because you're going to be putting out these money tokens and they escalate at the end of each round. You play 4 rounds. First, you put out 5s and 10s and 20s and 50s. I love teaching this game. It's one of the easiest teaches I've ever had. The next thing that I really enjoy about this whole process is the round structure. And every single turn, you are always doing one small thing, but one impactful thing. In the first part, you're putting out these chips and you can put them anywhere. Love that freedom. Then you're putting out these cards. You can put out one card at a time. You'll put all of them out and you'll put them anywhere. Once again, you have so much freedom, but that choice is really important. And then the last part is you move your character. And I love this because turn order is huge. You can see where people are going. You can move 0 to 4 spaces clockwise, and wherever you land, you're going to resolve that in the next phase. After everybody moves, once again, one at a time, you'll flip over the cards at the areas that you've been exploring and then give payouts of those locations. And the fact that the money scales from round to round is huge because this money is going to make each successive round more important, but the turn order for the next round is determined by whoever has the most money in the last round. What a simple system. You place out chips, you play cards at those locations, you move, and then you get a huge payout. This gives you continuous bonuses in the form of being showered with currency. It has really high highs, really low lows, which is wild but the low lows are not super terrible because the game is so short, and the next round has the potential to completely cover those losses, so you never feel bad, even if you've lost out on a huge amount of money. And the best part about all of this is it's completely player driven. There is no luck, no randomness here. It's all player choice. I love this concept because who do you have to be upset at? Yourself. It's your fault that you predicted incorrectly, and when you get that big win, it's your fault that you had that awesome windfall of money. I love Vabanque, and I think it's so awesome to give this crazy amount of choice to the players, and it leads to this huge chaotic, upsetting but also extremely satisfying event. And the fact that it's a filler game and so short means it's going to be one that you finish, are like, whoa, that was crazy, and then probably want to play again. Vabanque is up there with some of the filler games that I think I'm going to be gravitating towards a lot. And the greatest part about this one is it plays all the way up to 6, and it plays very well at 6. So Vabanque is a wonderful filler game. It's joined the tier of games like Coloretto and Kaching and For Sale with these fillers that I'm probably going to be bringing to a lot of bigger events. And I'm just very impressed with the box. So big shout out to chairman of the board here for this recommendation. I am quite impressed. And those are the games. Those are all the games that I've been playing. And I'm curious to know what you think about these games, about my questions that I've posed to you, and just in general, your experiences with these titles. I'll go over some of the games that I've been playing this week in a big list format here. I think I may have missed out on some. I'll be honest, I've been pretty bad about logging plays. Honestly, it's something that I don't really like to do because when I'm playing games, I'm usually in the zone. So afterwards, I have to think about it. But I'll quickly go over some of them now. We've got Glory to Rome, Perseverance, Castaway Chronicles, Episode 1, Familiar Tales, LongShot the Dice Game, Survive, Escape from Atlantis, Nemesis Lockdown, Super Fantasy Brawl, Blood Rage, Capital X2 Generations, Marvel Champions, Ginkgopolis, El Grande, Arc Nova, Hadrian's Wall, Detective Club, Vabanque, Jamaica, Biblios, Clever Cubed, Taco Cat Goat Cheese Pizza, Caverna, and No Thanks. Once again, if you have any questions about any of these games, please let me know in the comments of this video. And thank you so much for being here and watching. If you're here in the live chat, please feel free to make any comments or any suggestions in that chat feed. I'll leave the chat up for a little bit to answer any questions, but then I'll go ahead and wrap it up this morning. But thank you so much for joining me. And if you're watching later, make sure to answer those questions. The first one is, when is too much freedom in a game a bad thing? And then the second question is, what expansions are going to drastically change the game for you? And when is that a good thing and was that a bad thing? So my example was Glory to Rome, because I think that Republic expansion is so simple in how it changes things, but it's a pretty drastic difference in the gameplay with that population of the resources because of the pairs of wilds. Let's get some water really quick. While we have this last minute, I think I'll go ahead and just share some games that I'm excited to play in the near future. Right now, I think that talking about Sleeping Gods again makes me really want to play another campaign of that. I'll be honest with you. I love me some Sleeping Gods. I've got a nice table that's cleared off to put it up on. Sounds pretty good. I think I want to play some more Perseverance. I'm having a good time with that. I'd like to try the solo mode because I've only played the competitive versions of it so far. Other games that sound exciting to play. We got a address notification for Burn Cycle, which is very exciting. I love me some chip theory games, so I'm excited to see what this new one has to offer. A Played some more Capital Lux, which I am always enjoying, and we saw the NorthMan, which is why Blood Rage appeared. And you'll notice this list of games we've played is a bit smaller because I played a lot of the same games over and over again, with Blood Rage being one of them. So very, very Viking mood. The Northman soundtrack is pretty dang great. The movie and filmography is awesome. I think it's a great film. So this is, yeah, those are the things that are going on. I'm just excited to play more incredible games, honestly. One game of Caverna we played the other day was I played Trolls, and they were hilarious because they make their weapons out of sticks, and they were terrible creatures. They would eat their puppies and sheep. They were essentially eating the bones of the creatures. So they got a better food yield from them. Oh, what a crazy game, but good stuff. All right, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. But thank you so much for being here this morning and for watching. And for those of you tuning in later, thank you so much for being here and sharing your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching SideGame Strong.